The autumn sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Willow Creek as Martha Williams stood chained to the weathered wooden post in the town square. The iron shackles around her wrists had rubbed her skin raw, but she kept her chin high despite the humiliation burning in her chest. Around her, a crowd of men gathered like vultures, their eyes assessing her as if she were livestock. "Now, gentlemen, this here's a fine specimen," called out Sheriff Dobbs, his voice carrying across the square. 19 years old, healthy as a horse, and untouched. Her pa owed considerable debt to the bank before he passed, and the law says his property goes to pay what's owed. Martha's green eyes flashed with anger. "I am not property," she said through gritted teeth, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The sheriff ignored her protest. "Bidding starts at $50. Do I hear 50? From the edge of the crowd, Thomas McKinnon watched the proceedings with growing disgust. At 45, the weathered farmer had seen enough cruelty in his lifetime. His calloused hands gripped the brim of his worn hat as memories of his late wife Sarah and their son James flickered through his mind. They had died in a barn fire 3 years ago, leaving him alone on his homestead with nothing but grief and regret. $50, shouted Buck Morrison, a known drunken troublemaker. His yellowed teeth showed in a leering grin as he stepped closer to Martha. 60, called another voice from the crowd. Martha's heart pounded as the bidding continued. She had lost everything when her parents died of fever last month. The bank had seized their small farm, and when they discovered her father's gambling debts, they declared her part of his estate to be sold. She had spent the last week in the town jail, praying for a miracle that seemed increasingly unlikely. $75. Buck Morrison's voice grew more aggressive. "I got plans for this one, boys. She worked real hard on my place." The crude laughter that followed made Martha's stomach turn. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the voices and the stares. In her mind, she could hear her mother's voice from years past. "Keep your dignity, Martha. No matter what happens, they can't take that from you." $80. The crowd was getting excited now, sensing the competition. Thomas McKinnon had heard enough. He stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow over the smaller men. $100, he said quietly, but his voice carried clearly across the square. The crowd turned to look at him. Buck Morrison's face twisted with anger. "McKinnon, you old fool. What you want with a woman? You gonna talk to her like she's your dead wife?" Thomas's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. $100, he repeated firmly. Sheriff Dobbs looked around the crowd. "Do I hear 110? 110 anywhere?" Buck Morrison spat in the dirt. 105. 120. Thomas countered without hesitation. The bidding continued for several more rounds until Thomas's voice rang out with finality. $200. A hush fell over the crowd. $200 was more money than most men in Willow Creek saw in 6 months. Buck Morrison cursed it under his breath, but stepped back, knowing he was outmatched. Going once, going twice, Sheriff Dobbs looked around hopefully for another bid. "Sold to Thomas McKinnon for $200. As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas approached Martha slowly, pulling out a worn leather wallet. "Here's your money, Sheriff," he said, counting out the bills. Sheriff Dobbs unlocked the shackles with a rusty key. Martha rubbed her wrists, looking up at her owner with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. Thomas McKinnon was a tall man with graying brown hair and kind eyes that held deep sadness. His clothes were simple but clean, and his hands showed the calluses of honest work. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Martha Williams," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded. "Well, Miss Williams, my name is Thomas McKinnon. But as far as anyone in this town is concerned, you're now Martha McKinnon, and you're my son James's widow." Martha's eyes widened in confusion. "Your son? He died 3 years ago," Thomas explained quietly. But his name will give you protection and respectability. No one will question a grieving father taking in his son's widow. For the first time in weeks, Martha felt a spark of hope. Why are you helping me? Thomas looked toward the mountains in the distance, his expression thoughtful. Because everyone deserves a chance at dignity, Miss Williams. And because ... He paused, his voice growing softer. Because my Sarah would have done the same thing if she were here. The ride to Thomas McKinnon's homestead took 2 hours through winding mountain trails. Martha sat beside him on the wagon bench, stealing glances at this mysterious man who had saved her from a fate worse than death. The autumn air was crisp, and golden aspen leaves danced in the breeze as they climbed higher into the foothills. Tell me about your son, Martha said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Thomas's hands tightened on the reins. James was 22 when he died. Good with horses, better with people. He had just gotten engaged to a girl from Denver named Rebecca. His voice carried the weight of old grief. They died together in the barn fire, trying to save the animals. I'm sorry, Martha whispered. I know what it's like to lose family. Your parents? Fever took them both within a week of each other. Ma went first, then Peo just ... gave up. Martha's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for weeks. He started drinking and gambling after that. Sighed he couldn't live without her. I guess the debts were his way of joining her. Thomas nodded with understanding. Grief makes people do strange things. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Martha gasped. Spread out before them was a beautiful valley with a modest log cabin, a red barn, and fields that stretched toward the mountains. Smoke curled from the cabin's chimney, and cattle grazed peacefully in the meadows. It's beautiful, Martha breathed. Sarah designed the layout, Thomas said with pride. She said a home should feel like it's part of the land, not fighting against it. They pulled up to the cabin, and Thomas helped Martha down from the wagon. An elderly Mexican woman emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. Her weathered face broke into a warm smile. Thomas, you're back. And who is this lovely senorita? Elena, this is Martha ... McKinnon, James's widow from back east. She's come to live with us. Elena's eyes widened with surprise, but she quickly recovered, opening her arms to Martha. Mia, welcome home. You look so thin. Come, I have stew on the stove. Inside the cabin, Martha was struck by how warm and lived-in it felt. Handmade quilts covered comfortable furniture, books lined wooden shelves, and family photographs sat on the mantelpiece. Elena bustled around, filling bowls with hearty beef stew and thick slices of fresh bread. Elena has been helping me keep this place running since ... Thomas trailed off, sitting heavily at the wooden table. Since Thomas became too stubborn to take proper care of himself, Elena finished with a knowing look. Now eat, both of you. And Martha, tell me about yourself. Over dinner, Martha shared her story more fully. Her parents had been schoolteachers in a small town in Kansas before moving west to try farming. She had learned to read and write, do figures, and even speak some French from her mother. She could cook, sew, and had helped her father with farm work. You're educated, Thomas observed with approval. That's good. This country needs more people who value learning. What will people think when they find out I'm here? Martha asked, worry creeping into her voice. The story is simple, Thomas explained. You married James in Denver 2 years ago. You've been living there since then, but after his death, you decided to come live with your father-in-law. Elena and I will back up the story, and most folks won't question it. Elena nodded vigorously. Is verdad. And if anyone asks too many questions, they'll have to answer to me. That evening, Thomas showed Martha to a small bedroom that had clearly been prepared hastily. Clean sheets covered the bed, and a small vase of wildflowers sat on the dresser. This was James's room, Thomas said quietly. I hope you'll be comfortable here. Martha looked around the simple space. A few books sat on a shelf, and a photograph of a young man with kind eyes smiled from the dresser. "He looks like you," she said. He had his mother's heart, though. Always trying to help everyone. Thomas paused in the doorway. "Martha, I want you to understand something. You're not my property, despite what that paper says. You're free to leave whenever you choose. I ask only that you give it some time. See if you can find a home here." "Why?" Martha asked for the second time that day. "Why are you really doing this?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Because I couldn't save my family when they needed me most. Maybe ... maybe helping you helps me find some peace with that." After he left, Martha sat on the bed and looked at the photograph of James McKinnon. "I don't know if I can live up to being your widow," she whispered to the image. "But I promise I'll try to be worthy of your father's kindness." Outside her window, she could hear Thomas chopping wood in the fading light, the steady rhythm somehow comforting. For the first time in months, Martha felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. 3 months had passed since Martha arrived at the McKinnon homestead, and the harsh Colorado winter was beginning to soften into early spring. She had settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural, helping Elena with cooking and household tasks, tending to the small vegetable garden, and even assisting Thomas with the lighter farm work. The townspeople had accepted the story of James's widow without question, and Martha had begun to feel something she hadn't experienced since her parents' death: belonging. "Martha, can you help me with these ledgers?" Thomas called from his desk. "In the corner of the main room. Your schooling shows you're better with numbers than I am." Martha approached the desk where Thomas was hunched over account books, his brow furrowed in concentration. Over the months, she had noticed how he carried himself differently now, with less of the heavy sadness that had seemed to weigh him down when they first met. "The cattle sales from last fall?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "Yes, and I'm trying to plan for spring planting. Elena thinks we should expand the vegetable garden, maybe sell produce in town." As they worked together, their hands occasionally brushed as they pointed to different figures. Martha had grown comfortable with Thomas's presence, finding him to be a man of quiet strength and surprising gentleness. He never spoke harshly, never demanded more than she was willing to give, and had shown her more respect than any man in her life. Elena entered the room carrying a tray of coffee and fresh biscuits. "You two work too hard," she chided, but her smile was warm. "Thomas, there's news from town. Dr. Peterson stopped by. His wife is expecting again, and they need help with the older children. He's asking if Martha might be interested in teaching them a few days a week." Martha looked up with interest. "Teaching? I'd love that. The pay would be modest, but it's yours to keep," Thomas said. "You could save up for whatever you might want in the future." Martha had been thinking about the future more often lately. When she first arrived, she had assumed she would eventually move on, perhaps to Denver or California. But as winter melted into spring, she found herself reluctant to consider leaving. This place, these people, had become more than shelter. They had become home. "Thomas," she said carefully, "what happens when people start asking why James's widow hasn't remarried? It's been 3 years since he died." Thomas set down his pen and looked at her seriously. "What do you want to happen, Martha?" The question hung in the air between them. Over the months, Martha had caught herself watching Thomas as he worked, admiring his quiet competence and the way he treated everyone with dignity. She had seen him reading aloud to Elena when her eyes grew tired, witnessed his patience with struggling calves, and observed how he still talked to Sarah's photograph when he thought no one was listening. "I want to stay," she said quietly. "This is the first place I felt like I belonged since my parents died. But I don't want to be a burden to you forever." Elena cleared her throat meaningfully. "You know, in my pueblo, we have a saying, El corazón ve lo que los ojos no pueden ver. The heart sees what the eyes cannot see." Thomas looked at the older woman with raised eyebrows. "Elena, are you meddling again?" "See, and I'm very good at it," she replied with a grin. "Now I'm going to visit my sister in town for a few days. You two can manage without me." After Elena left the next morning, the cabin felt strangely quiet. Martha and Thomas worked side by side, but there was a new awareness between them, as if Elena's words had given voice to feelings they had both been trying to ignore. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Thomas spoke softly. "Martha, I need to tell you something. When I bought your freedom that day, I told myself it was just the right thing to do. But over these months, quotes, Thomas." Martha turned to face him. "I know what you're going to say, do you? You're going to say that you care about me, but you feel like you're betraying Sarah and James's memory. You're going to say that a man your age shouldn't be thinking about starting over with a woman young enough to be his daughter." Thomas looked at her with surprise. "You do know." Martha reached over and took his weathered hand in hers. "And I'm going to tell you that Sarah would want you to be happy, that James would want you to have a family again, and that sometimes the heart sees what the eyes cannot see." They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared. Finally, Thomas spoke. "If we did this, if we made this real, it would have to be honest. No more pretending you're James's widow. People would know the truth." "Let them talk," Martha said firmly. "I've learned that reputation is just what people say about you when you're not listening. Character is what you do when no one's watching. And Thomas McKinnon, you have more character than any man I've ever known." 6 months later, Martha Williams became Martha McKinnon for real, standing beside Thomas in the little church in Willow Creek with Elena beaming in the front pew. As they exchanged vows, Martha looked out at the faces of their neighbors, some curious, some disapproving, but many genuinely happy for the quiet farmer who had found love. Again, Dr. Peterson approached them after the ceremony. "Mrs. McKinnon, I want you to know that my children have learned more in these past months than they did in the year before. Would you consider starting a real school here in Willow Creek?" Martha looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "I think that sounds like exactly what this town needs," she said. As they walked back to their wagon, Thomas took Martha's hand. "Any regrets?" Martha squeezed his fingers. "Only that it took us so long to admit what Elena saw from the beginning." Elena, overhearing, laughed. "Perfin!" Finally, two stubborn people listened to their hearts. Looking back toward the mountains that surrounded their valley home, Martha McKinnon knew she had found more than rescue that day at the auction block. She had found family, purpose, and a love built on respect and shared dreams. The chains that had once bound her were gone, replaced by ties of affection that would never feel like bondage. In the distance, thunder rumbled over the peaks, promising the spring rains that would bring new growth to their land and their life together.